So we have all seen movies where someone's been kidnapped and ransom is demanded. There's a scene that always unfolds like this. The family of the kidnapped victim is very stressed out and gathered in the living room of their palatial home with the police around them. They're all nervously pacing around and waiting for a call from the kidnappers. The police have set up a recorder and some kind of gadget that will trace the phone call back to the criminals if only the call lasts long enough. So the call comes in and a family member answers, usually the wealthy father or some kind of business tycoon. The kidnapper states the demands, which is always an outrageous sum of money. The father becomes enraged and says something like, "You dirty so-and-so, you're not going to get one dime out of me unless I know my son or my pet French bulldog or whatever's been kidnapped is alive." Then the voice of the son, or the French bulldog, is heard over the phone to prove they're still alive and doing reasonably well. The kidnapper then hangs up a split second before the cops can trace the call, which always makes me wonder, why do they keep doing that if it never works? Don't these people ever watch movies? And then they come up with some audacious plan to deliver the money and make a dramatic rescue all at the same time, which results in a car chase and other explosive mayhem. And along the way, we might discover that the kidnappers are really perfectly rational people with a legitimate grievance against the father, who's actually a very evil man whose giant industrial plant has poisoned their entire community. Unless, of course, Harrison Ford is playing the father, because his agent would never let him play a bad guy. But he is able to single-handedly rescue the French bulldog while tossing the evil kidnappers off the back of Air Force One. We've all seen that movie, right?
Get off my plane.
Get off my plane. I may be getting some details mixed up, but that phone call where the kidnapped person or dog speaks is called the proof of life. It's an important plot point because without that proof of life moment, the story would just fall apart. Starting a couple weeks ago and on Easter and continuing today, in our scripture readings, we're hearing proof of life stories. Today we heard Luke's version of this, Jesus appearing to the disciples for the first time following the resurrection, and at first they think that they're seeing a ghost. Last week we heard John's version of this, the one where Thomas initially doubted the story until he had that proof of life himself, that he had seen Jesus with his own eyes. Luke tells us that Jesus even asked for something to eat, and the disciples give him some fish. And that detail also appears in other gospel accounts because it's proof that all of this was not an illusion, that Jesus was no ghost. When's the last time you saw a ghost get hungry and eat fish? It just never happens. There you go. Proof of life. But then Luke tells us Jesus says something to the disciples after he's explained to them the meaning behind his story, all the amazing things that he ever said or did, and what they're now supposed to go out and do with that. He says to them, "You are witnesses of these things," which is a fascinating choice of words, witness. What does a witness do? Well, a witness provides evidence, testimony, a true account. In the Bible, to be a witness means you demonstrate something by speaking or by doing. In other words, it's not enough to merely know something or to believe in something. What's important is what you actually do with that knowledge or belief. That's how you give proof of life. Otherwise, your story kind of falls apart. You know, it's interesting how religions evolve. For a long time, faith has been understood mostly as a question of, what do I believe in my head and in my heart? As a minister, I'm often asked, what does your church believe? Which is kind of a funny question for us because the truth is, within our church, there's a fair degree of uniqueness between what one person might believe and what another person might believe. The nice thing is, we can all still gather around a communion table, look each other in the eye and say, I love you. But I can understand the question. Folks don't want to bother getting mixed up with a bunch of people they disagree with all the time. That only makes sense. We all know that through the ages, there have been long and bloody conflicts between Christians. Now, sometimes they were fights between Christians who were Protestants and Christians who were Catholics. Those awful wars were about all the usual things people fight wars over: power, money, and territory. But when it came down to it, those conflicts were also about belief. Simply speaking, Protestants believed more in an individual kind of relationship and interaction with God, while Catholics believed more in a collective relationship and interaction with God. Now, that is painting things with a very broad brush. But that distinction of belief could mean the difference between life or death out on the battlefield. If you were injured flat on your back on the ground with a Catholic sword hanging over your head, you just might decide it's a very opportune moment to renounce all that crazy stuff John Calvin had been preaching about and swear allegiance instead to the Pope. Because what you believed mattered to those people. Thankfully, these days we tend to treat our differences of belief a little more gently than that. We have the attitude that what we believe is nobody else's business, really. And if we do have differences in beliefs as a group, we're content with just going off and starting our own denomination. Happens all the time. The idea that our faith, our belief, is an intensely personal thing is reinforced by the church, and it is sustained by our culture. It's a private matter between you and your Maker. And no one in our society, after all, should ever be condemned or discriminated against because of what they believe in their heart and mind, so long as their actions don't cause harm to anyone else. We're very tolerant that way, and that's a good thing. My next door neighbor may be a Hindu or a neo-pagan who worships a variety of gods that are found in nature. What do I care what she believes as long as she mows her yard? But we've hung on to an assumption about belief that I think is a bit stunted and that doesn't see the big picture of what we're created to do and called to do in this life. And that's the assumption that our beliefs define us, that our beliefs prove who we are. That assumption is exactly what's in back of that question I sometimes get about what our church believes. Now, plenty of people will say that our beliefs do determine how we act, and there's a whole lot of truth to that. If we believe that we should help people who are less fortunate, we might donate to charities that help those people, right? We might act out of compassion about what we believe about loving our neighbor when we collect lots of food like Salem does and we deliver it to food pantries. But what if I believe in my heart and mind that I should love my neighbor and I have a lot of compassion for my neighbor and yet I do nothing? What if I just say, gosh, that's awful, those people need help, but I never actually help? Then does my belief in helping others prove anything? Does my belief in being compassionate actually make me a compassionate person in practice? Does my belief that I'm called as a person of faith to love my neighbor really matter that much to my neighbor? When that love I feel amounts to just a profound, warm, fuzzy feeling in my heart? There's been some frustration in our culture lately about a certain phrase that often pops up when something really bad happens. A shooting, a natural disaster. It's an expression of moral support, and I think it's usually very heartfelt. The phrase is thoughts and prayers. A tragedy occurs and people say, we're keeping the victims in our thoughts and prayers. Now, I don't think we should criticize people who say that. Thoughts and prayers matter. I've been on the receiving end of thoughts and prayers, and it makes a difference to know that someone really cares about me and what I'm going through. The criticism comes when thoughts and prayers are not accompanied by any kind of action, if it's a situation where action would be helpful. It's a problem because it sounds like a worthless gesture to offer thoughts and prayers for the families of people killed in a mass shooting when you continue to support politicians and policies that allow anyone to walk into a gun shop and buy an automatic rifle with no background check. In that case, your thoughts and prayers sound pretty weak and a bit too late and hypocritical. It's what mental health professionals would call cognitive dissonance, holding two opposing beliefs at once. It's bad for innocent people to die, but it's perfectly fine for people with behavioral problems to be able to acquire the guns to kill those innocent people. Or maybe that's not cognitive dissonance at all, but a simple failure to appreciate that what you believe, as lofty as it may be, really doesn't amount to a hill of beans to anyone but yourself if you don't act in accordance with that belief. So that's the problem people have with thoughts and prayers alone. Sometimes that's all we can offer, really, but all too often it seems that's all that's being offered, when there could be so much more that would make a positive difference. In other words, thanks for all the thoughts and prayers, but we'd also like to see some proof of that. I think part of it boils down to this. Is belief, my believing in anything, primarily a private thing? Is it something I keep inside? And is it something I feel I need to believe, that I must believe in order to be counted among the faithful? After all, we have plenty of examples in Scripture that seem to tell us that God knows what's going on inside our hearts and minds, that God knows what's written on our hearts. God tells the prophet Samuel, "Don't judge this scrawny shepherd boy by his outward appearance. That doesn't matter. What matters is on his heart, his character, his purity, what he believes." So it seems to be true that God knows what we believe, and that matters. But I think it's also fair to say that if you're concerned at all with what God thinks of you, that you have the right beliefs, then God very likely wonders what in the world you're actually doing with that belief. How is your belief being proven? Now, the phrase, actions speak louder than words, that's not in the Bible exactly. But in all the stories that we hear, like the one from Luke, where Jesus tells his followers they're expected to be witnesses, it sounds a lot like that. Imagine any of those folks present with Jesus that day, believing that the power of love was stronger and more enduring than anything, but then saying or doing nothing about that, deciding that what they believed was purely a personal thing, and then never acting on it in any way that would ever matter. What if they thought that believing was just sufficient in itself, and that proving it wouldn't really make any difference? Let me say, I don't believe that's true of us. In fact, to a large degree, I don't think our beliefs are what define us or prove anything. It's just the opposite. It's our actions are the proof. That's where it's found. We might very well say that we collect food for pantries, or we take a boatload of Christmas gifts every year to kids who no longer have a safe place to call home because of what we believe. But what if we turn that around and say, we simply give generously of ourselves? And it's in the giving that we learn what we believe and prove what we believe. It's in the opening of our doors to LGBTQ teenagers. It's in the creating of a safe space for little kids who are transgender and their parents to gather and play and just be themselves for a while. It's in the welcoming of immigrant families, brushing up on their English skills. It's in being a church that welcomes people who have been made unwelcome elsewhere, or who thought they would never again set foot in a church. It's in doing that we are witnesses. It's in all of that and more that we speak and act and offer proof of life, the life where God's love is unlimited. That's what I believe.